Alright, today I'm going to talk about something I think trips up even veteran comic creators, and that's comic lettering. As a disclaimer, I'm also not an expert letterer. I do what gets the job done, and that's about it. So all of this is going to be basic stuff to get you going if you don't know anything about lettering comics. First off, if you haven't already, make your own font. If you want to hand letter, there's still a few tips for you here, but just start with a pre-made font, rasterize the layer, and lower the opacity, then draw over it on another layer. Or you could go all Ames lettering guide method, and after you've put in your speech bubbles, make guidelines to follow for size and spacing, but I'm less proficient at that, so let's go back to making a font. I'd suggest going to a website like Calligrapher. One thing you will need to account for are the two different I's. You'll want to include one with the two lines and one that's just a straight line for the capitalized I. But if you can't figure out how to do that, don't worry about it. I actually just edit the I's myself. And if you're a bit iffy thinking, why do I need to make my own font? Can't I just download one that's already there? You could. But honestly, this is just way easier to figure out rights-wise and art style-wise. If it's a font you made, it's obviously okay for commercial use, and most importantly, since it's your handwriting, usually that means it will automatically mesh well with how you draw. So just make that font. When you're done, download the file. You should be able to just click to install it once it's there, and voila, it'll show up in your font choices. Now, the program. I use Clip Studio Paint. It's more industry standard to use Illustrator, but Clip gets it done, and if I ever have to manipulate the text enough that I'd need Illustrator, such as for a sound effect, I'd prefer just to make an approximation with it in raster layers in Clip, and hand letter it myself. Since I use Clip, I'm going to be describing everything in Clip terms, but a lot of these options are available in most programs that you'd use for lettering. So, open up your program, select your new font, and now, what size should you make it? Well, I kind of just guesstimate it, which isn't a great answer, but sometimes you just kind of have to eyeball these things. A more foolproof way is to just take a comic page that's the same ratio as what you're making, plop it in your file, lower the opacity, and use the lettering on it to figure out general size. The reason I can't give you a specific size is because of resolution. A 100 dpi canvas is going to need a different font size compared to a 300 dpi or 450 dpi. Generally, webcomics will also want bigger font sizes since those are read on phone screens. But for webcomics, you can use a similar method as what I was talking about earlier to figure out size. Just use a webcomic you find and the lettering size there as an example instead. So now you've got your font size, but first let's make a speech bubble. For Clip, I just go to Layer Properties, click on Outline, make the outline size about 10, make the color fill black, change my draw color to white, then draw a circle. You can make the outline color for this any color you want, you can make the fill color any color you want. I'm just doing generic bubble. And I'm not really going to be talking about bubbles in this, I'm just describing how to make one for lettering benefit right now. So now you've got your bubble, now add a little tail. Now it's time to type. Fill in the bubble with what you want. Be careful with how much space you leave between the bubble edge and your type. Don't crowd it, crowding it bad. Generally, I'd say leave about this much space. Definitely don't let anything touch the edge. And if you're using Clip, you may think, this kind of looks all spaced out and weird. Well, that's because the letter spacing settings for fonts, particularly fonts you've made, are not good. At least not good for comics. So click that little wrench icon. You'll want to edit the font in the bubble to be able to see what your editing does, but keep in mind this will not save the settings for the font as a whole. Once you're done changing the spacing, mark down what settings you've got, then click out of the text layers or delete them completely, then click on the wrench icon again, then re-edit your font spacing. That should save it so the spacing will always be what you have set it. The main settings you're gonna need to change are in font and line spacing / alignment. You're definitely going to want to change character spacing and line space. I'm gonna put my settings on screen, but what you need to change them to is going to vary. Remember that trick I mentioned, taking a comic page and using that as guide for font size? Do the same thing here, but for spacing. I'd also suggest zooming out or squinting to try and see if the font still looks readable, because you do not want to smush those letters too close together. It'll be trial and error, but generally using the sizing and spacing from actual comics as a guide should help. And now you've got a nice formatted font that works with your art. Awesome! And now for some quick and dirty tips for typing. All caps is the industry standard. Sometimes comics don't do all caps either at all or for specific instances only, like whispering. Generally, uppercase is good for uniform lines. Y's and G's and Q's can really mess you up if it's lowercase. And it's preferable for readability. I wouldn't try to do lowercase unless you know what you're doing. The different I's I mentioned earlier also have to do with readability. Generally, the single line I is used for anything that is not the pronoun I. This is so it takes up the least amount of space in the word. The pronoun I uses the 2 lines so it's more immediately readable. There's a general amount of words you should stick to in each bubble. You can break the rules, of course, but usually about 24 words is a decent standard. Always try to make sure speech bubble tails point towards the character's mouth, as a general rule of thumb. Sometimes you can't do that because they're facing away or they're out of panel, but if you see their mouth, point toward it. Like this, not like this. And generally, those are my basic tips and tricks for digital lettering with Clip. If you want a more detailed explanation on bubble placement or dividing speech or so on and so forth, leave a comment. If you want something else, tell me what you want. I want to talk about what people want to know.